My fiancée said, "You'll never find anyone better than me," when I told her I was unhappy. I said, "Probably not." For weeks later, she saw something at her favorite restaurant that made her have a complete meltdown. I, 31M, thought I knew what heartbreak felt like until 4 weeks ago when my fiancée of 3 years decided to show me just how little she thought of me. The memory still burns fresh in my mind, playing on repeat like a broken record that won't stop spinning. We were sitting in our shared apartment, the same one we'd been planning to give up for something bigger after our wedding next spring. The lease renewal papers sat unopened on the coffee table between us, and I'd been staring at them for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to say what had been eating at me for months. The words came out clumsy and raw. I told her I was unhappy, that something felt fundamentally wrong between us, that I couldn't shake the feeling we were heading toward disaster if we got married. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, not surprise, not hurt, but something cold and calculating. Her response cut deeper than any knife ever could. She told me I'd never find anyone better than her, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested she'd been thinking it for a long time. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, like she was commenting on the weather, made my blood freeze. I surprised myself with my reply. I told her she was probably right, and I meant it. At that moment, sitting across from someone I planned to spend my life with, I genuinely believed I was too damaged, too ordinary, too fundamentally flawed to deserve better than someone who could wound me so effortlessly. She moved out that same week. No tears, no dramatic scenes, just efficient packing and a forwarding address. She took the good coffee maker and left me with the broken toaster, which felt symbolic in a way that would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. The first 2 weeks after she left were exactly what you'd expect. I wallowed. I ordered too much takeout, binge-watched terrible shows, and ignored calls from concerned friends. My sister stopped by twice, and each time I managed to convince her I was fine, just needed some space to process everything. But something strange happened during the 3rd week. The fog of self-pity began to lift, and I started seeing things clearly for the first time in months. I realized how much of myself I'd lost during our relationship, how many compromises I'd made that weren't really compromises at all, just me giving up pieces of who I was to keep the peace. The gym membership I'd let lapse became active again. The photography hobby I'd abandoned because she found it boring suddenly filled my evenings. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, started reading again, began taking weekend trips to places she'd always dismissed as pointless. Most importantly, I started therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I'd become someone who could accept being told I didn't deserve better and actually believe it. My therapist helped me see patterns I'd been blind to for years. How my ex had gradually isolated me from friends, dismissed my interests, and slowly convinced me that my thoughts and feelings were somehow less valid than hers. It wasn't dramatic abuse. There were no screaming matches or thrown objects, just a steady erosion of my self-worth that had happened so gradually I hadn't noticed until it was nearly complete. Week 4 brought an unexpected development. Through a combination of therapy insights and genuine self-reflection, I'd started to feel like myself again. Not the diminished version I'd become during our relationship, but the person I'd been before, confident, social, optimistic about the future. A friend from work mentioned his cousin was visiting from Portland, someone in her late 20s who worked as a graphic designer and loved hiking. He thought we might get along and asked if I'd be interested in meeting her over dinner. The old me would have made excuses, claimed I wasn't ready, insisted it was too soon. The new me, or rather, the recovered me, said yes without hesitation. Her name was Sarah, and within 10 minutes of meeting her, I understood what I'd been missing. She listened when I talked, asked follow-up questions about things I mentioned, and had opinions about everything from local restaurants to foreign films. She laughed at my jokes, shared stories that were actually interesting, and when I mentioned my photography, she asked to see some of my work with genuine curiosity. We went to Marcello's, this little Italian place downtown that had become popular over the past year. I'd never been there before. My ex had always claimed it was too expensive and probably not worth the hype, but Sarah had read great reviews and was eager to try it. The evening was perfect in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Sarah told me about her design projects, her travels, her complicated relationship with her family. I found myself talking about dreams and goals I hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared laughter. We were halfway through our entrees when Sarah's expression suddenly changed. She was facing the restaurant's entrance, and I watched her eyes widen with what looked like surprise and concern. She leaned forward and quietly mentioned that someone had just walked in who was staring at our table with obvious hostility. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The tension in the air, the way other diners had started glancing toward the entrance, the familiar sound of expensive heels clicking angrily across hardwood floors. My ex had just walked into what was apparently her favorite restaurant and discovered me having dinner with someone else. Sarah asked if we should leave, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I told her we should finish our meal, that we had every right to be there and weren't doing anything wrong. But I could feel eyes boring into the back of my head, could sense the storm building behind me. What happened next unfolded like something from a nightmare. My ex approached our table with the kind of barely contained fury I'd seen her direct at waiters who got her order wrong or store clerks who moved too slowly. She stopped directly beside our table, close enough that other diners couldn't help but notice. The words that came out of her mouth were loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. She demanded to know how I could do this to her, how I could bring someone else to her favorite restaurant, how I could move on so quickly when we'd been together for 3 years. Her voice carried that particular pitch that makes everyone in earshot uncomfortable. Sarah handled it with grace I didn't deserve. She calmly suggested that perhaps this conversation would be better conducted privately, that the restaurant wasn't the appropriate venue for this kind of discussion. Her quiet dignity only seemed to enrage my ex further. The meltdown escalated quickly. My ex began cataloging my supposed failures as a partner, my inadequacies as a human being, my inability to appreciate what I'd had with her. She told Sarah that I was emotionally unavailable, financially irresponsible, and generally not worth the trouble. The entire restaurant had gone silent, servers frozen mid-step, diners openly staring. But something extraordinary happened as I listened to this public character assassination. Instead of the shame and embarrassment I would have felt 4 weeks earlier, I felt something completely different: pity. Looking at someone I'd once planned to marry, watching her destroy her own dignity in a crowded restaurant because she couldn't handle seeing me with someone else, I realized how deeply unhappy she must be. Sarah's response was perfect. She thanked my ex for the warning, mentioned that everyone has flaws and that's part of what makes relationships interesting, and suggested that perhaps my ex should focus on her own happiness rather than monitoring mine. It was polite, firm, and devastating in its simplicity. That's when my ex completely lost control. She began shouting about how I'd manipulated Sarah, how I was probably lying about our relationship, how no one could trust anything I said. She called me pathetic, worthless, and several other things that made nearby families gather their children closer. The restaurant manager approached, clearly uncomfortable but determined to restore order. He politely but firmly asked my ex to lower her voice or take the conversation outside. She turned her fury on him, demanding to know why they were taking sides, insisting that she was a regular customer who deserved better treatment. I finally stood up, not to engage with her, not to defend myself, but to address the manager. I apologized for the disturbance, offered to pay for our meal and leave, and thanked him for trying to handle an impossible situation professionally. My calm response seemed to shock my ex into momentary silence. Sarah stood as well, gathering her purse with unhurried movements that somehow communicated more composure than a dozen angry words could have. She thanked me for dinner, told the manager she hoped the situation wouldn't reflect poorly on what was clearly an excellent restaurant, and headed toward the exit. As we walked past my ex toward the door, she made one final desperate grab for control. She told Sarah that this wouldn't last, that I'd show my true colors eventually, that she'd be back to warn her when it all fell apart. Sarah paused, turned back with a slight smile, and delivered the perfect response. She told my ex that she was sorry things hadn't worked out between us, that breakups were always difficult, but that everyone deserved to move forward and find happiness. She hoped my ex would find whatever she was looking for. It was compassionate, mature, and completely devastating because it highlighted just how differently these two women handled conflict. Update 1. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. By the next morning, my phone had 17 missed calls from my ex, along with a series of increasingly unhinged text messages that ranged from apologies to threats to promises that she'd changed. I screenshotted everything and blocked her number. Sarah texted me that afternoon, apologizing for the drama and asking if I was okay. Her concern was genuine, and when I called her back, we ended up talking for 2 hours about everything that had happened. She admitted she'd been nervous about getting involved with someone recently out of a long relationship, but seeing how I'd handled the situation had actually reassured her. We met for coffee the next day, and she told me something that changed my entire perspective on the restaurant incident. She said watching my ex's meltdown had shown her exactly why our relationship had ended. Not because I was inadequate, but because I'd been with someone who couldn't handle not being the center of attention, who saw other people's happiness as a personal threat. My ex's social media presence became increasingly erratic over the following days. She posted vague references to betrayal, shared articles about rebounds and emotional manipulation, and made cryptic comments about people showing their true colors. Friends started reaching out to ask what was happening, having seen enough to piece together that our relationship had ended badly. The most satisfying part was how little it affected me. The person who would have spent weeks analyzing every post, every comment, every possible hidden meaning, was gone. In his place was someone who could look at the digital tantrum with detachment and genuine concern for someone who was clearly struggling with rejection. Sarah and I continued seeing each other, taking things slowly but with an honesty I'd never experienced in a relationship. She met my friends, I met hers, and the contrast with my previous relationship became even sharper. Where there had been tension and careful navigation of mood changes, there was now easy communication and shared laughter. The photography hobby I'd rediscovered led to weekend trips where Sarah and I would explore small towns and national parks. She had an eye for composition that complemented my technical skills, and we began collaborating on a project documenting forgotten roadside architecture. It was the kind of partnership I'd never imagined possible. My ex made a few more attempts to disrupt this new happiness. She showed up at my apartment building one evening, though security prevented her from getting to my door. She contacted mutual friends, trying to get information about Sarah and our relationship. She even created a fake social media account to monitor my posts, though her comments were distinctive enough that I recognized her immediately. Each attempt to insert herself back into my life only reinforced how right I'd been to end things. The woman I'd once thought was out of my league revealed herself to be someone whose self-worth was so fragile that my happiness represented an existential threat. Update 2. 3 months after the restaurant incident, I received a text from an unknown number. It was my ex, writing from a new phone after I'd blocked her original one. She wanted to meet for coffee, claimed she had things to say that would help us both find closure. She promised to be calm and respectful, insisted she'd learned from her mistakes. I showed the message to Sarah, and we talked through my options. Part of me was curious about what she wanted to say, but a larger part recognized this as another attempt to regain control of a narrative that had moved beyond her influence. Sarah supported whatever decision I made but pointed out that my ex had already had multiple chances to communicate maturely and had chosen chaos every time. I drafted a response that was brief and final. I told her that I appreciated her desire for closure, but that I'd found everything I needed to move forward. I wished her well and asked her to respect my decision not to maintain contact. Then I blocked the new number. 2 days later, she showed up at my workplace. Security cameras captured her pacing in the parking lot for over an hour before she finally approached the building. The receptionist called me, describing someone who matched my ex's description and asking if I wanted to see her. I asked security to escort her off the property and document the incident. That evening, I received calls from 3 mutual friends. My ex had contacted each of them, claiming I was harassing her, spreading lies about our relationship, and generally trying to ruin her reputation. She'd asked them to intervene, to convince me to stop whatever campaign of destruction I was allegedly waging against her. The irony was perfect. In her attempts to paint me as the aggressor, she'd actually revealed to our friend group just how unstable she'd become. 2 of the 3 friends who called offered to help if she continued bothering me, and the third admitted he'd been wondering what had really happened between us. Sarah's response to these escalating incidents was to suggest we document everything. Not because she thought we'd need legal intervention, but because patterns of behavior needed to be recorded in case they continued or escalated. Her practical approach to problem solving was another reminder of what healthy partnership looked like. The photography project Sarah and I had started was developing into something more substantial. We'd documented over 50 sites across 3 states, and a local gallery had expressed interest in showcasing our work. The collaboration had become a metaphor for our relationship, 2 people with different strengths working towards something neither could achieve alone. My ex's final attempt at disruption came during the gallery opening. She appeared an hour into the event, dressed formally as though she'd been invited. She approached several guests, introducing herself as my former fiancé and offering unsolicited commentary about the photographs. She told one couple that she'd actually been to many of these locations with me, claiming shared credit for inspiration and composition. Sarah handled it brilliantly. Instead of confronting my ex directly or asking her to leave, she began introducing her to other guests as someone who'd known me during a different period of my life. She asked my ex questions about her own interests and projects, effectively shifting the conversation away from our shared history toward my ex's current activities. The strategy worked perfectly. Faced with genuine interest in her own life rather than her connection to me, my ex found herself without a script. She made awkward small talk for 15 minutes before quietly leaving. Several guests commented afterward on how gracefully Sarah had handled what could have been a disruptive situation. Update 3. The gallery show was a success beyond our expectations. Local newspapers covered the opening, and we sold 12 pieces in the first week. More importantly, the collaboration had evolved into something sustainable. We booked 3 more exhibitions over the next year, and were planning a book proposal. Sarah moved in with me 6 months after that first dinner at Marcello's. Not because of external pressure or timeline expectations, but because we'd found a rhythm that made sense. She kept her own space as a studio, and I kept mine for darkroom work, but we built something together that enhanced rather than diminished our individual identities. My ex's attempts to insert herself into our lives gradually decreased in frequency and intensity. The last incident was 8 months ago, when she left a handwritten letter under my car windshield. It was 4 pages of rambling thoughts about regret, missed opportunities, and her belief that I'd never be truly happy without her. I read it once, filed it with the other documentation, and never responded. The letter revealed something I'd suspected but never confirmed. She'd been monitoring my social media, tracking my activities, and interpreting my happiness as a personal attack. The woman who'd once told me I'd never find anyone better had spent months watching me prove her wrong, and it had become an obsession that was consuming her life. I felt genuine sadness reading that letter. Not sadness about our ended relationship, but sadness for someone whose self-worth was so tied to external validation that another person's happiness felt like defeat. She'd chosen to spend months focused on my life instead of building her own. and that seemed like a tragedy worth mourning. The contrast with Sarah became even sharper in light of that letter. Where my ex saw competition and threat, Sarah saw partnership and possibility. Where my ex demanded constant validation, Sarah offered and expected mutual support. Where my ex treated love like a zero-sum game, Sarah approached it as an opportunity for both people to become better versions of themselves. Today marks exactly 1 year since that dinner at Marcello's. Sarah and I returned there last night, and the manager remembered us from the incident. He seated us at the same table, which felt symbolic in a way that would have seemed forced in a movie but felt perfect in real life. Over dessert, Sarah asked me something that made me realize how completely my perspective had changed. She wondered if I ever regretted not trying harder to work things out with my ex, if I sometimes thought about what might have been different if we'd gone to counseling or taken a break instead of ending things completely. The question surprised me because the answer was so clear. I told her that the restaurant meltdown had been a gift, even though it hadn't felt like one at the time. It had shown me, and everyone else, exactly who my ex really was when she didn't get her way. No amount of counseling could have fixed someone whose response to my happiness was to try to destroy it publicly. Sarah nodded and mentioned something that gave me chills. She said she'd been thinking about my ex's prediction that I'd never find anyone better, and how it had probably been intended as a threat, but had actually become a challenge. Not a challenge for me to prove her wrong, but a challenge for both of us to define what better actually meant. Better, we decided, wasn't about finding someone more attractive or more successful or more anything measurable. Better was finding someone who celebrated your growth instead of limiting it, who saw your happiness as something to contribute to rather than compete with, who understood that love was about building something together rather than tearing each other down. As we walked home, I realized that my ex had been right about one thing. I probably wouldn't find anyone better than her. But she'd been wrong about what that meant. I wouldn't find anyone better because I'd found someone completely different, someone who made the whole concept of better irrelevant by approaching relationships from a fundamentally healthier place. The last I heard through mutual friends, my ex had moved to a different city and was apparently doing well. I hope that's true. I hope she's found whatever she was looking for, though I suspect what she was looking for was validation that could only come from within. The photography project continues. Sarah and I are planning a cross-country trip to document abandoned drive-in theaters, and we've already gotten preliminary interest from a publisher. But more than that, we've built something sustainable and healthy, something that makes both of us better without requiring either of us to become less than we are. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just living well, growing into who you're meant to be, and refusing to let someone else's limitations become your own. Sometimes it's as simple as proving that you can indeed find something better, not better than them, but better than what you settled for when you believed their assessment of your worth. The person who believed he'd never deserve better is gone, replaced by someone who understands that everyone deserves partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. That transformation, more than any dramatic confrontation or clever comeback, was the real victory. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.